And what we want to do in this section is to look at some specific cantos. So if you've got your volume out, let us say one thing about translation first, and that is we suggested that we use the Musa translation. And there are a number of good translations of Dante out, and there's nothing magical about this particular one. I think we like the notes pretty well. We like the introductory essays to each of the 3 volumes. And as some of you know, because you have the volume, it's now been all bound together in one, although without all the notes. But there are always new Dante translations occurring. The great problem with Dante translations is there are many translations of Inferno, and a lot of people either stop or die or never finish going all the way. And so there's a certain continuity, obviously, in wanting to use a translation of all 3 parts by the same person. And so we are going to use the Musa. But certainly he doesn't have a monopoly on being a good or great translator of Dante. And there are a number of alternatives, and there will be more alternatives, because there are 2 major new translation projects in the English that are now 2/3 of the way done.
Yeah, and in fact, worth saying something about both of them, because I'm fond of both of them. When Paradiso comes out, that will be a tremendous boon. One is the translation that's being done by Robert and Jean Hollander, and I believe that that's being published by Doubleday, and so it's sort of going to be more likely to be found in borders throughout the land. Again, both Inferno and Purgatorio have been published. It's a dual language edition, which is of course always an advantage. You know, if you've done anything with any Romance language, you can kind of peek over to the Italian side and get an awful lot out of it. And of course, it's something that is the single biggest lack, I think, in the Musa translation. The other one that's also 2/3 of the way through is the translation by Robert Durling, D-U-R-L-I-N-G, and Ron Martinez. And that one is being published by Oxford. In both cases, the notes are pretty complete, but the notes are a little bit different. Hollander seems to be much more conscious of and sort of speaking to a long tradition of Dante commentary. In other words, it seems to infer or imply that you've already been sort of acquainted with some of the tradition of Dante scholarship. The notes don't seem to me to be as useful to somebody coming to it for the first time, but it needs to be said that I'm finding the translation itself very good, and also the Durling and Martinez translation very good. So that, to me, it's a race to see which one gets published first, and hopefully it will be in an edition cheap enough so that when we're doing the Dante course together, we can use that. Alas, it won't be in time for next semester, but it should be coming down the pike fairly soon. The other ones that are available in accessible editions that have already done all 3 volumes. The Ciardi one, of course, was standard for a long time. Myself, I'm not such a great fan of it because an awful lot there where you see something that turns out to be intensely poetic, it turns out to be the poetry is Ciardi's and not Dante's. Again, not to try and knock it unless you've tried it. Obviously, translating Dante is an enormously difficult proposition, but it seems to me that a lot of teachers have found it very accessible to, let's say, high school students. So from my point of view, if it works, that's fine, but it's not something that I would use in my own class. The other one, I see a couple of copies around, the Alan Mandelbaum translation. Mandelbaum has the advantage of being dual language in a cheap Bantam edition, I think. The problem with Mandelbaum is that I don't think the notes are anywhere near as good as the notes for Musa. That having been said, my sort of one-liner on translations is if you bring 6 Dantists in the room, they will have 7 opinions about what the best translation is. So, you know, sort of what we like is not necessarily what you would get if any other Dantist came in to sort of talk about the same issue. And so, you know, you might want to just kind of mess around in Borders and see what they have and see which seems most appealing. But, you know, that's what it comes down to is for us, over the years, Musa has given us a pretty good bang for the buck and works pretty well in a classroom, which is certainly a useful thing to know about. Bill mentioned that people publish all the time editions of Inferno. The Pinsky, he had no intention when he published that of going on. He did the Inferno and he had no plans. And Merwin did a Purgatorio with no plans to do Inferno or Paradiso. There's also one that was published just a year or 2 ago by Norton. I forget the name of the translator, but he actually tried to duplicate Dante's Terza Rima, and I thought it was largely a disaster. And it all of a sudden occurred to me why this was the case. One of the things that I did as a kind of exercise with the class, Bill and I were teaching Dante. This was 2 years ago, and Bill took a couple of days off while they cut him open from stem to stern and did a little open heart surgery. So, you know, I had to kind of fill in, do a little song and dance while Bill was busy mending. And one of the things that I did was I brought in a couple of passages from this new Terza Rima thing. You know, tried to imitate Dante's rhyme scheme where you have an A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, etc. Rhyme for each of the stanzas, the terzine. And I realized that you got a problem when you have a language where everything ends in a vowel. Okay, means every word is going to rhyme with every 6th word in the language, right? And one where things can end in anything, where every word is going to rhyme with every 26th word in the language. So if you're going to try and do that Terza Rima thing in English, what you have to do is search around for any rhyme word that you can find in any part of the line. And so what it means is that in order to get the rhyme, what you sacrifice is Dante's word order. And of the two, according to my way of looking at things at any rate, the word order is far more important than the rhyme. You want to get the rhyme, look at the Italian. There are, by the way, spoken CDs of Dante in Italian. And one of the things that's very useful to do is get any translation that you like and listen to the Italian while you're following along an English translation. You can get CDs of the entire Commedia in Italian, and it's a kind of a neat thing to do even if you don't have very much Italian. You'd be amazed at how well you can follow when you're looking at the thing in English. So again, just that went on a little longer than I thought, but I think it's useful for you know, if you happen to be sort of wandering around a Borders or wandering around a computer.
He does that. Once I saw him stand up, I knew this was
I had to go to the blackboard. I had her the whiteboard. Okay.
I'm used to this.
Yeah.
So that's what you did all the time I was in the hospital?
Yeah,
You padded the course?
Exactly. I said, now here's the stuff that Cook wouldn't let me do.
Now I know. Yeah. I'll never get sick again, I swear to God. What we're going to do for the rest of this session is to take a look at 3 cantos, Canto 6, Canto 6, and Canto 6. And in doing that, we're going to do a couple things. First of all, we're going to follow through an idea that we presented in the first section, which is that if we only read what Dante has to say about a particular topic in Inferno, we're only reading his first author. We're not following through his own ideas as he himself did. We need to remember that after all, most of the characters talking in Inferno are either A, wrong, or B, dumb. Okay? Wrong, of course, applies to all the people he meets there, because if they were right, they wouldn't be there. And dumb applies to Dante himself, because after all, he's just left the dark wood of error. And he's basically dumb as a rock, especially in the early cantos of Inferno. So we need to make those distinctions But we also need to be aware of the fact that Dante is not finishing his thoughts on politics or sex or the papacy or whatever it might be when he discusses them in Inferno. So it's important to say we're going to talk about first offer, second offer, final offer in a real sense. Secondly, as we will see, all of these cantos are what we would call today perhaps political cantos. Now, we don't want to separate politics from religion, from art, from other things, because those are modern categories. And we have to remember that knowledge got chopped up differently back then than it does now. And of course, anybody who's been in a university very long knows that we continue to chop it up differently. In my tenure at Geneseo, SUNY Geneseo, where we teach, for example, my department moved from the social sciences to the humanities. We didn't do anything. History didn't change, but our place in the curriculum changed. So we all understand there's a certain kind of arbitrariness in the way we divide up knowledge, although we also understand the necessity of it. Politics here is not going to be politics in the narrow sense of the word as we look through these three cantos 6, if you will, but obviously a way of organizing life and building community and establishing justice on earth is a very fundamental part of because it provides a context for people's journey through life to the afterlife. And so this is, if you will, part of the large vision of the Commedia. It's not a sidetrack, it's not a particular subject he takes time out to talk about. So it may be odd, but the first time Dante really discusses politics at any length is in the canto in which Dante meets the Florentine, well, let's be nice, town drunk, in the circle of gluttony, a guy named Ciocco, a nice name that means hog. We may expect that Dante would, when talking to Ciocco, talk about overeating, that 14th glass of wine, eating a whole lemon meringue pie, or whatever it might be. But in fact, they don't talk about food and drink at all, even though the literal sin of gluttony is, of course, the overindulgence in food and drink. It's a sin of incontinence. But rather, once the conversation gets going, the conversation turns back to Florence, and it turns to Florentine politics. So if you have a copy of Inferno with you, turn to Inferno 6.
One of the things that I find to be very gutsy about our performance here today is that we decided to do the first canto on gluttony after the dinner that we had at Positano last night. I'm not sure exactly what the connection is, but somewhere Dante is laughing his butt off. Ciocco, I said to him, this is, if you have the Musa edition, well, the pagination I'm sure is different. This is Canto 6, and somewhere around line 38 or so. Ciocco, I said to him, your grievous state weighs down on me. It makes me want to weep, but tell me what will happen if you know, to the citizens of that divided state, are there any honest men among them, and tell me, why is it so plagued with strife? And he replied, after much bloodshed, after much contention, that dinner last night has a lot to answer for. They will come to bloodshed. The rustic party will drive out the others by brutal means. Then it will come to pass this side will fall within 3 sons, and the other rise to power with the help of one now listing toward the sides. Well, a couple things to say. First of all, as Bill implied, the interesting thing about this is that when they begin to talk, they don't talk specifically about the nature of the sin that Ciocco is there for. In the previous canto, lust, one of the all-time biggies, what they talked about was lust. That is to say, Francesca told her story, and through her story, we got the way in which desire overcame reason. It's this wonderful set piece. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And among other things, it's just a wonderful, wonderful way to learn how to read the Commedia, or at least read the infernal parts of it, because we see there that Francesca kind of becomes a model for what all of the sinners do, or all of the sinners are. Francesca is really, really good at taking the blame and shifting it to someone else or something else. Francesca blames a book for why she's in hell. Francesca blames love, personified as an abstraction, for why she's there in hell. Francesca basically says, I had no control, seized me, what could I do? Well, in there, you have something of the essence of hell, because had she taken some responsibility for what she was there for, she wouldn't be there. Hell is all about folks who are trapped in the choices that they have made and given the choices that they have made. Well, again, to sort of look at it as a sort of quick entry into hell, when I'm teaching this quickly to my humanities students, I say, why are people in hell? And they say, because they've committed bad sins. And I say, yeah, but the people in purgatory have committed bad sins, and the people in paradiso have committed bad sins also. What's the difference? And the light bulb goes off, and they said, these people have committed bad sins, but they haven't repented. So we get to find out in that first example that repentance is all about knowledge, in a way, that you have to kind of know what you're doing, and once you do that, you're in a different sphere altogether. We'll find those folks in purgatory. But here you have, in this second circle of incontinence, we go from lust to gluttony, no real discussion of gluttony at all, except for Dante to say, well, that's pretty disgusting. Now let's talk about politics, okay? Now, it's easy to sort of see that, and critics have, I think, unfortunately seen it as Dante's way, Dante the poet's way of talking about what he's really interested in, despite what his scheme is doing. Well, we would argue, in fact, that that's a conspicuously bad way to go about interpreting the poem. That it's precisely in those places where Dante seems to be taking some kind of a digression that you actually do get to something of the essence of the sin. So to frame it in terms that are appropriate to where we are, what does this little discussion about Florentine politics have to say about gluttony? And equally important, what does a discussion of gluttony have to tell us about Florentine politics?
Again, let's not forget, the setting is in the year 1300. The guy who's taking this journey, Dante the Pilgrim, lives in Florence. He's not an exile. And so here he is, away from home, runs into a fellow Florentine, and says, hey, I got some questions for you. You know, we've had a lot of factional problems back in Florence. What do you know about it? Who are the good guys in this? Who's doing this? Who's doing what? He asked all these questions, and of course what we see is, and Ron read part of the answer, that Ciacco gives him an answer. After all, Ciacco is, even if he's looking from the Florentine gutter, in some ways, not quite literally, we don't know much about the historical character of Ciacco, but even if he is looking from the Florentine gutter, at least he has a different perspective on the political players. And he gives a sort of long and fairly careful answer, we might say. And he says, 2 just men there are, but no one listens. For pride, envy, avarice are the 3 sparks that kindle in men's hearts and set them burning. Okay, that's the end of Ciacco's little speech there. Notice how Dante comes back. With this, his mournful words came to an end, but I spoke back. There's more I want to know. I beg you, provide me with more facts. And then he goes on to ask specific questions about several people in the Florence of his day and the Florence of the generation past. Where are some of these guys who lived in the previous generation, end up in hell, end up in purgatory, heaven? You're down here. You want to know this. Tell me all about this stuff. And I think what we want to see is that what Dante is doing is being a glutton. We need to understand that gluttony, not in the most literal sense of the word, but Dante is committing a kind of political gluttony in the way I think we all understand it today, perhaps even more so. Because what do we hear today? Information is power. That's what Dante wants. He wants the goods on all these guys. He wants this angle because he knows he's going back to Florence, where he's a political player. Again, this is 1300s. We're set in, not the time of the exile. And we all know any piece of info you have, any data you've got, you can find a way to use it. That we all know the power of knowledge includes, if we wish to, the power to manipulate. By the way, I think this is one of the same reasons as St. Francis of Assisi always worried about scholars, because scholars very often use their superior knowledge to manipulate rather than to educate and to get to the truth. And what Francis worries about with scholars, Dante's playing politics here. He's very good at this. This is a very smart thing to do. You know, how's this for a good trump to play? Well, I know that Farinata is in hell, or I know somebody's in purgatory or heaven, because I got to go down there to meet him. And let me tell you that you're on the same direction, or if I do this, I will be able to move in such and such a way. We can understand how this is gaining a kind of political advantage for Dante. This is Dante, the C-SPAN junkie. This is Dante, the internet scammer. This is Dante, the guy who says every piece of knowledge I gained down here, remember he's dumb as hell, every piece of knowledge I gained down here, I can use for my profit back on earth, my political profit back on earth.
Maybe to push it a little further, if he gets to know just a little bit more, he'll be invited to be a talking head on Sunday morning talk show TV. With a profile like that, I think he's got a career. But it's worth pushing just a little bit farther, because of course there's an answer to most of the question about most of the folks that Dante asks about. And where is Farinata? As a matter of fact, we'll find him in hell in Inferno 10. Where is Tegiaio? We'll find him in Inferno 16. Jacopo Rusticucci, he's in 16. And Mosca is in 28. So all of the folks that Dante says, all the rest bent on doing so good, he seems to get it pretty wrong in terms of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. Well, the first thing that points to, of course, is that what Bill has already said. Dante is recently emerged from this dark wood of error, and so he's not seeing things all too clearly. What you see depends on what you're able to see, and generally, at this point in the poem, the pilgrim is not able to see a great deal. It's also, of course, very interesting. This is an example that shows that Dante is coming to all of this as a partisan. In other words, who's good and who's bad, from Dante's point of view, doesn't depend on a kind of universal moral frame of reference. What it depends on is whether you're on my side or on somebody else's side. Good or bad depends on which party you belong to. And it's exactly that limited perspective that Dante has to learn to outgrow in the process of moving through the Inferno, and indeed moving through the other parts of the Commedia. What Dante has to learn is that it's precisely that partisanship that's responsible for lack of any larger understanding of community, lack of any larger understanding of the common good, so that the very system that Dante is implicated in is part of the problem, not the solution. To go back to something that Bill said a little bit earlier, when Dante is first sent into exile, his goal is to get back into Florence and do to them what they'd done to him. Well, of course, in point of fact, that simply would be perpetuating the problem that got him there in the first place. And more important, it would perpetuate a system that simply looks at personal self-interest or interest of the party and takes that instead of any kind of larger notion of the common good. So what Bill says about gluttony here really is connected to the fact that, like all sins of appetite, the problem with sins of appetite is that they blind you to greater goods. That was certainly the case with lust, and even though lust presents it more dramatically, it turns out to be no less true when you're talking about gluttony, whether you look at it in its literal sense or in terms of this metaphoric political glut that Dante and Ciacco are mutually participating in. And just to say the obvious, what we see early on is that all of the sins that Dante sees in hell seem to be reflected in his own conduct when he's down there. So, for example, he swoons when Francesca tells her story. It seems to me that that's a suggestion that he's implicated in what's going on. He's getting into it here with Ciacco because this is the only way he knows to deal with political issues. And so gradually extracting himself from the position is one of the things that he has to do. It also reminds us of a very important thing here, and that is that the sins that Dante sees are really, the best one-liner for this, ghosts of Christmas future. Okay? In other words, he's looking at a mirror of himself, either in terms of what he is already or what he could become if he doesn't learn to straighten up and fly right. And so we can see hell then for Dante as a kind of electroshock therapy of the soul for him, as his last opportunity, if you will, to get it right. I think that's important because in a way that whole set of speeches at the beginning about why it's okay to take a trip to the afterlife, it's presented to him not so much as a reward for doing fabulous deeds, but it's presented to him as a last-ditch opportunity, as something special that's granted to him because the ordinary means of grace don't seem to be working with this dumb bozo. So we get to see that as it works itself out in this particular example, among many others.
When we want to move to Purgatory, but let me remind those of you who know the Inferno well, when Dante gets to what we would call Inferno 10, the circle of the heretics, you might recall he meets another fellow Florentine, in fact, this very guy, Farinata, who is mentioned in Inferno 6. And Farinata recognizes Dante's accent, and so he knows that Dante comes from his hometown, which is Florence. And it's very interesting to note the first thing that he asks Dante. What is your party, and who are your ancestors? Not, hi, we don't see a lot of Florentines down here, or guys.
Actually, they do see a lot of Florentines down there, but...
in fact, he's in tune with one, but, there's none of that sense of what they share, which is many things. I mean, they're Florentines, they're Italians, they're Christians, they're humans, a lot of things they share. The only thing they emphasize is what they don't share. My family is better than yours, and my party is opposite yours, is basically the attitude that Farinata takes as soon as Dante says, Alighieri family and wealth. Okay, the answer is Degli Uberti family, much superior to yours, and Ghibelline. And that sort of changes the course of the conversation, if you will, a great deal. And it's important for us to see how that works. Somebody once said about academic politics that it's so bitter because it matters so little. And in a sense, that's what we're seeing. These guys don't see very far. For Dante the Pilgrim, and for Farinata even more so perhaps, politics is all this sort of local, personal, detailed, my daddy's better than your daddy kind of politics. After all, we think about Florence because it was an independent country, in some real sense, in the time that Dante is living. We need to remember the city of Florence had about 100,000 people, packed into, those of you who have been there, pretty small territory when you think about where the walls are, or in most cases were, in Florence. They're packed in, they're tight, it's very personal. Much more personal than a city of 100,000 would be in modern America, where it's all spread out and everybody has their yards. Okay, that's not the way Italian cities worked or work for that matter. And so we're really dealing with politics at a very local, sort of gut, personal, I dislike you. 3 generations ago, your family threw garbage in my family's house. 2 generations ago, your son did something illicit to my great aunt. We're dealing with politics at that level. And we see all the anger and bitterness that comes with that. But when we get to Purgatory, oddly enough, Canto 6, we begin to get a broader view of the polis, of the polity, we might say. And that takes place in a conversation that Dante and Virgil have with one of Virgil's fellow hometown guys, as it turns out.
Before we get there, it's probably worth saying something about Purgatory and its relation to Inferno. One of the things that we've implied about Inferno is that the souls who are there are not changed in any essential way from what they were in life. There's one wonderful example of that where in the blasphemers, when somebody's sort of there giving the finger to God, we're told, as alive, so am I dead. And as is often the case in the Inferno, what one soul says about his own situation really does apply for all of them. So it makes a lot more sense to see that the souls who are there, their punishment is not something imposed from without, but simply the consequences of what they have become. They are getting exactly what they asked for, wanted and hoped for when they were alive, and they are getting it without any chance now of changing who they were. So if we look at the punishments from this point of view, we see that the punishment is simply what happens when, in various ways, you sort of implode with a kind of egotism that ultimately doesn't recognize anything except yourself. Now, when we get to purgatory, we have to deal with the fact that in purgatory, there's also what looks like punishment. And it's always a sort of interesting conversation to begin to ask the question, well, what's the difference between the kind of thing that happens in hell and the kind of thing that happens in purgatory? For one thing, we know that hell is a state that nobody is going to get out of, whereas purgatory is really, it's not an annex of hell, but the vestibule to heaven. And so that the folks who are in purgatory are already saved, and Dante makes this very emphatic by having them actually go through a gate, okay, at the beginning of purgatory proper in Canto 9, so that there's no doubt about their ultimate salvation. Well, if that's the case, then what do we say about the punishments that are there? The best one-liner that I've come across is that purgatory is a spiritual workout center. And if any of you have used the other kind of workout center, you understand that when you first get there, what you see are things that really do look like medieval torture devices. And when you start to use them, you realize that, in fact, they really are medieval torture devices. But if you keep at it, the anguish that you feel sort of lessens a little bit as it becomes more and more a matter of habit. And you kind of get into the habit, and then with some people I know, it gets to the point that if they don't have their workout that day, it's sort of like not having that coffee in the morning, they feel a little bit antsy. So that if you kind of take that and apply it to the soul, what you see there is the context that allows folks to get their spiritual muscles moving in the right direction and to give themselves good spiritual habits. It's more painful at the bottom of the mountain, less painful as you keep going up. So just to sort of think about that, you can see the sort of purgative effects of it. One other thing about the workout center analogy that works for me is that it is now the case, it used to be in the place that we live, if you wanted to see somebody that you know, all you have to do is go to the big supermarket that's open 24 hours a day, and you will see some students there, some fellow faculty members, some folks that you know at the town. Everybody goes to Wegmans because it's the only game in town, all right? Now it's happening that I see everybody at the workout center. I don't know what that's saying, but it's sort of, if I want to not talk about academic politics, I better make sure that I got the Walkman on and am just sort of doing all of this stuff and trying not to pay any attention to anybody. The point that I want to make is that the spiritual workout center analogy works very nicely on this level also. It's a communal experience. That what the Inferno is all about is individuals who isolate themselves from any kind of community. That, what Bill was saying is that people look at things only in terms of their family, their ancestors, and their party. Well, that becomes a way of ultimately giving way to only looking at things in terms of yourself. That the souls become so isolated so that there's nothing else except a self. Well, in a way, the opposite thing that happens in Purgatorio is people learn by all kinds of interesting, ingenious devices that what they're going to do as a community. Purgatorio, in fact, is structured according to the practices and the precepts of a monastic community where communal activity takes precedence. And we learn the way in which we are, in which our fate is embedded in the communities that we are a part of. So that whereas Inferno is always isolating, Purgatorio is always sort of welcoming. And we can see that difference very nicely. Again, Bill sort of introduced this by saying we saw Dante and somebody from his hometown. Now we see Virgil and somebody from his hometown in Purgatorio 6.
Okay, this is, again, those of you who are following along in the text, this is Purgatory 6 at about line 70, about line 67, let's say. Okay, remember, this is the territory that Virgil doesn't know as well as hell. So Virgil, Dante are walking along, chatting, meeting people along the way. This is still before we actually get to the gate, the formal entry into Purgatory proper. And Virgil needs a little direction. He stops this guy and says, "Can I get directions?" The shade ignored the question put to him, asking of us instead, where were we born and who we were. Again, this is similar to that question that Farinata asked Dante in Inferno 10. My gentle guide began Mantua. That is to say, the first word out of his mouth is Virgil's hometown. It's the subject, presumably, of a sentence. But that's as far as he got. And the other, until then all self-absorbed, sprang to his feet and came toward him. O Mantuan, I am Sordello of your own town, and the two shades embraced. Okay? This commonness they had is enough to bring them together. No, it doesn't matter who your family is, doesn't matter what neighborhood you went to, you lived in, or what school you went to, none of that mattered. We're from the same hometown. That commonality, there are no doubt things that divide them, although of course they lived in very different eras, but the point is, it's the commonality that matters here. And so one word, Mantua, and they embrace, while we saw exactly the opposite happening in, for example, that encounter between Farinata and Dante the Pilgrim in Inferno 10.
In fact, it's worthwhile saying a little bit about infernal embraces, too, because we see them, but it turns out that they are of a very different sort. Let's start with the first and let's end with the last. The first time that we see an embrace is with Francesca and Paolo in the circle of the lustful. They are being blown around in an eternal embrace, and yet when Francesca talks to Dante, there's no sign that Paolo counts in any way. He doesn't say nothing. And it's almost as though, who is this? I mean, it's like sort of bad jokes here about people who walk into bars with ducks on their head and stuff like that. There's something very strange going on about this relationship when all Francesca can talk about really is herself and see the world in those terms. The last set of sinners that we see mirrors the first in a lot of different ways, one of which is that they too are locked in a kind of embrace, with Ugolino munching on the head of Ruggieri. And so ultimately, Dante the poet's final take on evil and sin is that it is a kind of cannibalism, and that what starts in a sexual embrace, wrongly entered, turns out to be this really grotesque parody at the end of the Eucharist, this grotesque parody of any kind of community and the possibility of community itself. So that here are people who exist in a parodic relationship to an embrace, finally, of course, with Satan actually eating Judas and Cassius and Brutus. But here we see one that is genuinely affected by the commonality of citizenship. And that's a start for reconstituting a very different kind of community from what we see in the Inferno.
And then Sordello has some interesting things to say about Italy. Ah, slavish Italy, the home of Greek, ship without pilot, caught in a raging storm, no queen of provinces, whorehouse of shame. Not most delicate phrases. How quick that noble soul was to respond to the mere sound of his sweet city's name by welcoming its fellow citizens, while now no one within your bounds knows rest from war, and those enclosed by the same wall and moat, the Alps and the Mediterranean, even they are in each other's throats. Oh, wretched Italy, Search all your coast, probe to the very center. Can you find within you any part that is in peace? There is this kind of prophetic, and I use that word carefully, prophetic denunciation of Italy at the time of Sordello and Dante. They're roughly contemporary. So what we have here is Dante taking up this mantle of the prophet to some extent in the character of Sordello and denouncing the situation in Italy. Because the situation is, well, it's a situation that Dante encountered and participated in Inferno 6 and Inferno 10. Everybody is at everybody else's throat. There is violence, there is hatred, there is factionalism, there is separation. There's nothing like the bond of common good that we expressed in our embrace, Dante with Virgil. And so what we see here is a look at politics from a different perspective and in a larger scope. We're no longer talking about inside the walls of Florence. We're looking at Italy as an entity, and we're looking at it from a radically different perspective because Sordello, of course, is among the saved, as Ron points out, while Ciocco and Farinata are among the damned.
It's interesting also to see that this sense of expanding to a larger perspective is what characterizes very often the movement from Inferno to Purgatory to Paradiso, because we were limited to the local and the Florentine, and now this discourse ranges all up and down the Italian peninsula. And in fact, it's kind of interesting to see where it does go. See, for example, what happens, starting with line 102, you and your sire, whom greed for greater wealth holds back up there, have let this come to pass. The garden of the empire is laid waste. Okay, that means, of course, Italy as a whole. Come see the Cappelletti, callous heart, see the Monaldi, the Montecchi ruined, the Filippeschi fearful of their fate. When some guy named, Shakespeare, comes along a little bit later and writes about these same folks, the Cappelletti and the Montecchi become, of course, the Capulets and the Montagues. That the story of Romeo and Juliet is in fact the same story that Dante is talking about. And since that takes place in Verona, what Dante is suggesting is that the kind of factionalism that we've seen with the black and the white Guelphs in Florence is mirrored in all of the other cities in Italy as well. And so this notion of factionalism, which was sort of limited to this kind of local thing, when Dante's talking about it in Inferno 6, now is seen as part of this broader problem that relates to all of Italy and seems to be related to the notion that there isn't any larger force to keep folks from being at each other's throat. Notice that earlier thing, what matter if Justinian repaired the bridle? We've got the laws. Okay, that's what Justinian did. He guaranteed that all these laws were codified. So there's something that tells us that we should know what we ought to do, but the saddle is empty now. Nobody is sort of taking over. There is no political leader who is going to be able to bring unity out of all of this.
And when we look back to Florence, we say, the argument that Dante and Farinata have is not much more sophisticated than my daddy can beat your daddy and your mommy wears combat boots. It is just about that unsophisticated and that personal and that bitter. And of course, in a little bit broader context, we know that this has to do with Guelphs and Ghibellines. Dante is a Guelph and Farinata is a Ghibelline, and those are the two great factions that dominated Italy and its individual cities in the 13th century. Here we step back and say, okay, let's look at Italy now. What is the factionalism of Italy? What's keeping Italy from being united? And the answer is sort of the fire behind the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. It is the contest between the emperor, in this case the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope. And what Dante argues here, many other places in the comedy, in his book called The Monarchy, is that each one of those leaders is ordained by God and has certain functions in this society. And the problem right now, it's different in different eras. The problem right now is that the Pope, with his interest in temporal power, is usurping the authority of the emperor, and therefore that contest over something that there should be no contest over is what is causing this bitterness. it trickles up, if you will, and becomes a sort of universal struggle. It trickles down and becomes Guelphs versus Ghibellines. And so what we focus here on is not just looking at these two parties in Florence, but looking at the fact that God ordained the world to be governed in certain ways. There is to be a church, there is to be an emperor, they're both to be located in Rome, and they are to work in concert, each one given certain authority by God to make the world work right, to provide justice for the world. Right now, again, in a different era, the answer would be different. Right now, what's messing that up is the political desires and aggressiveness of the Pope, in particular, of course, at the moment the committee is set, Pope Boniface VIII. And so we begin to look at larger causes of what we saw happening in Florence with Farinata and with Chaco. And we're beginning to get a broader perspective of what the problems are, because you can't just solve the problems in Florence. The problems don't stop when you leave the walls of Florence, and therefore the problem is not just local. The problem is broader. We need to understand it more broadly. We might say today we need to contextualize what's going on in Florence in a larger reality.
And so when we get to Paradiso 6, we have an even larger context. You recall that in Purgatory, one of the folks who was mentioned was Justinian, the codifier of Roman law. Well, it turns out that Justinian is the speaker in Paradiso 6, and in fact, Justinian gets every word of the canto. This is the only canto of the 100 in the entire Commedia where there is only one speaker from beginning to end. It's Justinian, and he tells the story not from the point of view of Florence, not simply from the point of view of Italy, but from the point of view of the entire empire, and also he takes it on a kind of historical journey from its beginnings all the way up to the present. And at this point, it's worth also mentioning that Dante has in mind here a model for this notion. Okay, let's survey all of Roman history from beginning to present, because that model is presented to us in Virgil Aeneid. Take a wild guess in which book? In Aeneid 6. You'll recall that what happens there is Aeneas goes to the underworld to visit his father. The deal is, gosh, tough journey. Why should I bother to go on? Life has been so tough since Troy has fallen. And his father says, take a look, son. If you don't continue, this all isn't going to happen, and gives him a panorama of Roman history, starting from himself and his immediate descendants, and going all the way to the time of Caesar Augustus, when the book was written. So this panorama of Roman history is now picked up by Justinian, and adding to what Virgil does in the Aeneid are the 1,300 years which have taken place from the time of Virgil to the time of Dante. So that what we see is Roman history as seen from the perspective of one of its best emperors, going back to the beginning and forward to Dante's own time. So talking about expanding the canvas, we're expanding geographically to include the whole empire, east and west, as a matter of fact, and we are starting at the very beginning with Troy itself and moving right up to Dante's time. So what Justinian has to say turns out to be very important and very valuable.
And it perhaps doesn't start off with quite as big a bang in Paradiso 6 as we might expect. Here is Justinian, of course, by definition, he's saved, he's in heaven. And as Ron said, he gets every word of the 6th canto. The first thing he does is explain that he ran the empire from the wrong city. Okay? Once Constantine reversed the eagle's flight against the course of heaven which it pursued behind that warrior who wed Lavinia, 100 years and more, the bird of God remained on Europe's edge, close to the mountains where it first rose. Okay? Of course, the mountains where it first rose are Troy. Okay? It went from Troy to Rome, and somehow or other, Constantine shouldn't have done this, he went back. Okay, that the empire had migrated to Rome, but Constantine built the city of Constantinople, which of course a clever name for himself, his favorite emperor, and moved back there. And so Justinian starts out in a sense with a kind of apology. It's very interesting to see that. And notice one of the great lines of this canto is line 10, Caesar I was, Justinian I remain. That Justinian is my personal identity, Caesar was my job. That was the authority I was given, and I was given that with a purpose. But of course, that title is now passed on to someone else. I remain Justinian. It's a really interesting juxtaposition of title because, as we know, very often we think about people's titles as sort of part of their name. And he wants to make that distinction for us. Caesar I was, Justinian I remain.
Notice also that in that very beginning, Dante gives us a reminder that one of the texts that we need to take into account is Virgil's Aeneid, because he says, of course, it pursued behind that warrior who wed Lavinia. Well, the warrior who wed Lavinia is Aeneas. And Aeneas, of course, is responsible for the whole idea that the course of empire is from east to west, that it moves from Troy to Rome. So to move it back is literally to go against the course of the heavens, because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west as well. And what we see later on in Paradiso is how we are supposed to align ourselves to the perfection that we see in the movement of the stars, and in particular the movement of the sun. So Constantine here, as in other places in the Commedia, has a lot to answer for. What he's doing is sort of retrograde motion, as the astronomers in Dante's time would put it, and he has sort of gone back against the course of empire. Well, the important thing about that in terms of its relationship to Justinian, of course, Justinian reigns in the 6th century. His dates as emperor are 527 to 565, and one of the things that Justinian tried to do is reunite East and West. And in a measure, he was successful in doing that, but the way things often work, it's a lot easier to conquer than to hold what you've conquered. And so that brief period of unification really was not something that lasted very long. But Justinian gets points for that, and Justinian gets points for a lot of other things as he's presented here. It's very interesting to see all of the ways in which what Bill said earlier about the right relationship between secular and political authority also is sort of exemplified in the character of Justinian.
In fact, that's where we go in line 13. Because remember, what we had implied, certainly, and really more than implied, in Purgatory 6, is that it's that wrong understanding of the relationship between ecclesiastical and secular authority. We can use the somewhat anachronistic terms of church and state, I suppose. It's that wrong relationship that makes Italy so screwy. And again, we can argue that sort of trickle down into cities like Florence, divided by Welsh and Ghibelline. Well, let's tell you how it's supposed to work. Before I had assumed this task as emperor, I thought that Christ had but one nature and no more. And I was satisfied with this belief. In shorthand, what he's saying is, I was a heretic. I was a Monophysite. I did not accept the decrees of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, the Council of Chalcedon. That's essentially what he said. I was messed up on understanding the full humanity and divinity of Christ. But blessed Agapetus, he who was supreme shepherd of God, directed me with his enlightened words to the true faith. I trusted him, and what he knew by faith, I now, meaning now that I'm in heaven, I now see clear as you can see all the contradictions, see all contradictions are both true and false. And then, once I was in step with Holy Church, God in his grace inspired me to assume the task to which I gave all of myself. Okay, this is the way it's supposed to work. This is the job of the Pope, to make sure that we get it right, that we get right the doctrine and other things we need for our salvation, to be my guide and my spiritual teacher in these things, and it's my job to trust him on this one. To recognize the office, and to recognize what God gives to that office, and therefore to say, well, gosh, I thought it was the other way, and I've heard 74 arguments for it the other way, but if you say this, and you are the great shepherd of the church, okay, I accept that. Then I can get on with being a good emperor. And so we see here this wonderful cooperation, this wonderful integration of the need for spiritual and secular authority. And we get a model for how it's supposed to work. After in Purgatory 6, we get the model of how it's not supposed to work, but the way it's being practiced in Italy in Dante's day.
Now, what's really interesting about Dante's, if you will, additions to the story is the fact that he takes it up to the present, because, of course, what that means is that Dante is stating in the strongest terms that he possibly can that the history that takes place from the time of Justinian on is still the history of the empire. That Dante is pushing very hard for the continuity between essentially Aeneas and the present. That it's a story which continues on into the present. And so Dante makes this kind of huge chronological jump and goes to Charlemagne, sees that as a continuation of the empire, and then sees how that empire has disintegrated, ultimately breaking down into the very factions that are responsible for local politics in Dante's own time. Which is to say, of course, what Dante is now doing is saying, see, all that local stuff that we talked about back in Inferno 6, all of that squabbling about who's in, who's out in Florence, is really part of a much larger picture of rule and of empire and of ideas of community that can't really be understood apart from understanding the idea of Rome and understanding the idea of a world empire. Again, things that he argues in more philosophical terms in his work on world government, or on monarchy as the most recent translation has it. So he goes on to talk very specifically about the factions claiming for their part what really ought to belong to the whole and to a much larger sense of the common good.
And that, of course, is the problem we've seen all the way back in Inferno 6. The problem is taking one's particular position, whether it's family or party or faction, we might say today, and treating it as the only thing that matters. And therefore, everything that gets in the way is something to be got out of the way. We see that happening in local Florentine politics. And Dante says one group sort of takes the imperial symbol, but uses it only to support its own faction. That's wrong. The other group opposes the imperial symbol, which of course is the eagle. That's wrong. These are both people appropriating, highfalutin symbols, highfalutin language for their own personal, private goods, not for the good of the whole. And so he takes on specifically the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Let them, the Ghibellines, let them connive under some other sign. Okay, don't let them claim the Roman Empire's eagle as their own, because they're only interested in, well, the Ghibellines and the power that they can get. Let not the new Charles, who is the king of Sicily, trust his Guelphs to tear the banner down. Okay, both sides are messing this up. This is not Ghibelline good, Guelphs bad, or vice versa. Both sides are erring. Just like he also says that if the Pope is too aggressive in claiming political power in Purgatory 6, so too the Emperor is sort of a wimp, he says. Now, the Emperor really needs to really make powerful claims to what's his. That it's not that you start blaming one side or the other side. What you realize is each side, however you might agree with it or not agree with it, each side is only interested in part of the whole. Justinian is interested in the whole. And Justinian resents anybody, especially those who claim with their language or their symbols to represent the whole, who only represent a part.
Yeah. We probably ought to turn things over to discussion now, but I want to make one final footnote, and that is that Justinian ends this canto not with some kind of universal thing, but a very personal story about somebody who is also here, who was despised in his own lifetime for doing a good job as a political figure, but was not recognized as such, and in fact was sent into exile. Well, in fact, the story that he tells is a story that quite clearly anticipates and models Dante's own exile, somebody who is thrown out of a position of political power and is going to have to sort of make his living door to door as a beggar, as Dante himself will have to do. And notice that what he says, very last lines of the canto, Romeo, proudly, old and poor, departed, and could the world know what was in his heart as he went begging door to door his bread, though praised today he would be praised still more. Well, in effect, what we see here is that just as Inferno presents negative examples for Dante to avoid, Inferno is all about seeing a mirror of where his bad behavior will lead him. In Paradiso, we see examples of good behavior, folks that he ought to imitate. And here you have somebody who provides a model for Dante in his exile. We would suggest that that model is presented in a great number of the figures that Dante sees. Models for exile starting with Romeo, and perhaps most important, the figure of Francis of Assisi as he's presented in The Circle of the Sun. So that what's happening here is that we not only have the big picture, but we're being told that Dante himself is going to have to be part of that big picture. We see a kind of inkling into how Dante is going to fit in to something that is much larger. Okay, so let's discuss and.
Yes, sir.
Maybe this is a little bit off topic, but I've always been intrigued by towards the end of Purgatory, where Dante is sort of handed off from Virgil. And given the fact you just described how, as you go through the poem, there's always this sense of greater inclusion as you get, from Inferno eventually to Paradiso. That seemed to be sort of a departure from that theme, because it's a very abrupt ending. In fact, it's not even a handoff, so to speak. Virgil just sort of disappears with something. And I was wondering what the general sense of scholarship is about that and your place.
Well, the disappearance of Virgil is, of course, one of the most poignant and therefore wonderful moments in the entire Commedia. One way to take a look at it is that it's been anticipated in a lot of ways throughout the poem, because we get to see places where Dante kind of moves ahead of his teacher. And, if you kind of take that old saw that a teacher's job is to make himself or herself obsolete, Virgil is doing that throughout the poem. So that by the time we get there and Dante turns around to say something to Virgil and Virgil isn't there anymore, what we see is both a very poignant moment and a shocking moment, but at the same time one that has been anticipated, so that he gets to play it both ways. Now, in doing so, what makes it even more wonderful is that that's one of the moments in the poem where Dante, the poet, manages to pack it with all kinds of references from Virgil's own poetry. So, for example, when Beatrice shows up, one of the best sort of announcements of Beatrice's appearance comes from a direct quotation from the Aeneid itself, so that Dante, the poet, is using Virgil to announce Virgil's own obsolescence and disappearance in the poem. It's hard to find a better tribute to Virgil than that, and it's also hard to find a better exemplification of the fact that Dante has taken from Virgil all that Virgil is capable of giving, that he has learned his lessons from Virgil so well that Virgil is no longer there. At the same time, it seems to be that it's meant to be seen as this great loss, okay? The fate of Virgil is much debated still among Dante scholars. I mean, there's this sense that we can only assume that he's going back to his place in limbo, but what does that mean exactly? There are those, for example, who hold out secret hopes for Virgil's eventual salvation. And it's interesting to debate that particular issue. But I think that what Dante is trying to say is that Virgil by himself has on the one hand done his job, on the other hand pointed to the fact that he himself can't go all the way. He is a necessary condition for Dante's salvation, but not a sufficient one. So it's made as abrupt as possible so that the loss of Virgil is emphasized, even as we see the poet learning the lessons that Virgil has taught him.
Is there anything more than the mosaic? Was Ravenna, was it somehow related to empire besides just the mosaics?
Oh, yeah.
That Dante would pick up on? Is it just seeing that?
Oh, yeah, sure. What we should have said, of course, is that when Justinian decides that he's going to reconquer the Western Empire, Ravenna is his outpost for doing so, so that in some ways it's a second capital during this time. And you could argue that that huge building project that Justinian is mostly responsible for in Ravenna is a kind of mini version of what Justinian did by building Hagia Sophia and all kinds of other extraordinary monuments in the New Rome. I mean, in a way, one of the things that's very interesting is that if you're going to move Rome to someplace else, you better put up the buildings that put your money where your mouth is. And Constantine sort of started it, but it was essentially Justinian who brought Constantinople to sort of equal the old Rome in majesty and splendor, most specifically, of course, with Hagia Sophia. Well, in a way, Ravenna is mini Constantinople. And Dante has the advantage, of course, of seeing in Ravenna all of those mosaics which are the most splendid exemplification of this. And it's important for us to realize that that's a good place to see how the religious and the political all come together. And, you know, it seems to me that just sort of visually, Paradiso is Ravenna mosaics put to words, but at the same time he realizes all the other dimensions to it as well.
Just two additional thoughts. When Justinian reconquered some of it, albeit very temporarily, what we would call the old Western Latin-speaking Roman Empire, what he had to do is figure out a new administrative structure. He didn't want to go back to the old structure of having two emperors, one in Rome, one in Constantinople. And in fact, that would just not have been possible. So what he did was set up two, we might say, satellite offices of the empire, one in North Africa in Carthage and one in Ravenna in Italy. Obviously, they were both important Roman centers. Ravenna was the last place the Roman emperors in the West lived before the Roman Empire in the West came to an end in 476. And Carthage was the most important city, Latin-speaking city in Africa. So those are the obvious things to do. We'd love to know what Carthage looked like in Justinian's day, but alas, that's all been destroyed. In fact, any of the Carthages are destroyed in the modern city of Tunis, but we still have Ravenna. And one of the things you discover, the most famous of all the portraits, in quotation marks, of Justinian is in the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. And among other things, what you discover is he's right there next to his good old Archbishop of Ravenna. We really see in Tesserae, if you will, some of the sense of we're all in this together, we're all working together for the same goal. If you look at the shield that's held by Justinian's soldier in the mosaic, it's got the Chi-Rho on it. And so we are reminded of the fact that he is a Christian emperor, and the archbishop here, not the pope, but the archbishop of Ravenna, obviously represents ecclesiastical authority and is the apostle for that region, if you will. So the mosaics themselves express something that then Dante was able to, as Ron said, put in words through the Emperor Justinian in Paradiso 6. I have time maybe for one more before we break for lunch. Who else? Thought I saw another hand back there a minute ago. Yeah.
Well, it was just a question about Virgil and why he's sort of given permission to leave the vestibule and follow Dante all the way up to the top of Mount Purgatory before he has to go. He had some kind of special place, didn't he, in terms of Christian scholarship relative to pagan authors? Wasn't he understood to have had some kind of special insight into the coming of Christianity?
Yeah. One place to go is Virgil's Fourth Eclogue, which was universally interpreted in the Middle Ages as a pagan version of Old Testament prophecy anticipating the coming of Christ. So his special place would have been guaranteed by that for sure. Now, because of that, he therefore had a kind of career in the Middle Ages where he was looked upon as a sage and thought to have himself taken a trip to the underworld. In other words, the logic was something like this: how could Virgil have written so knowingly and movingly about the afterlife if he hadn't been given the special permission to do it? So there was that whole tradition. And then there was a tradition in which Virgil's own poems, especially the Aeneid, were allegorized in the Middle Ages, especially in the 12th century, and seen as an example of, this looks on the surface as though it were the story of this guy moving from Troy to Rome. What it's really about is the ascent of the soul to the divine. And it was given a very Platonic allegorical interpretation. What's interesting about Dante is when he comes back to it, he says, no, I don't want to look at it that way. I want to look at Virgil as Virgil. And the person who takes Dante on his journey for the first 2/3 of the Commedia is not meant to be seen as a personification of anything, but as the historical Virgil, with his poem really sort of standing for what he himself knows.
Let me just give one analog and put it in a little bit broader context. I'm sure some of you have been to Siena, and those of you who have might know that the original statues on the front are now in a museum. So you can get up real close and personal with them, and you read the labels of who all's there on the facade of the Cathedral of Siena. These were done, by the way, during Dante's lifetime in the 1290s by a sculptor from Pisa. Okay? And you look into it and see who they are. First of all, there are no New Testament figures. Okay, you've got Moses, not a surprise. You've got Old Testament prophets, not a surprise. You've also got one of the Sibyls and Plato and Aristotle looking down at you from the facade of the Cathedral of Siena, preparing you to enter into this building where you will ultimately come to be united with Christ in the Eucharist and whatever at the altar. And on the surface, that seems odd to us that you'd put Plato and Aristotle and a pagan Sibyl, kind of Sibyl you find in Virgil's Aeneid, on the facade. But it is the same kind of mindset that says there is wisdom and foreshadowing and knowledge in all of this, and if we read it right, along with the prophets and the law of Moses, it can lead us to understand better that central mystery that we're going to experience inside. You know, we very often view the Middle Ages as sort of very narrow in a lot of ways, and then all this sort of opens up in the Renaissance, where they finally discover these classical guys have something to say. Don't tell that to the designers of the facade of either the Cathedral of Siena, or where it's less complete, the Cathedral of Florence, which also had a Sibyl on its facade in the original plan by Arnolfo di Cambio.
Okay.
To lunch, as they say.
Yeah.